The Tuesday evening bingo at Flaxborough's public rooms had always been a subdued affair, if such a term could be applied to gatherings of 70 or more citizens intent upon wresting £1 notes from one another's laps by means of numbered cards and paper dabbers. The town's female population, bolstered by a smattering of retired men of rigid routine, attended in the same way they attended evensong or dentist appointments faithfully, without enthusiasm, and with only the mildest anticipation of gain. This evening, however, a slight disturbance in the order of things had crept in, though it was of the kind unlikely to appear in any report, even in the Flaxborough Citizen, which was not ordinarily averse to magnifying the trivial. The cause was a cough, not just any cough, but a sudden, dry and terminal-sounding bark that belonged, unmistakably, to Mrs. Ursula Hartby, seated midway along the second row from the front. The caller, a cheerful young fellow from the electrical shop, whose tie betrayed his habit of consuming jam doughnuts without sufficient napkinry, had just reached two fat ladies when the cough cracked through the hall like a snapped violin string. Several heads turned, not so much in sympathy as in faint irritation that someone should choose such an inopportune moment to expire. For example, Mrs. Hartby appeared to have done. Her dabber rolled to the floor, the row of neat blue blobs on her card abruptly terminated, and her chin descended upon the ample collar of her imitation fur coat with an air of permanence. It was Mrs. Flitch, a neighbour of indeterminate years and limitless commentary, who first declared, in tones more suited to the greengrocer's cue than to tragedy, good Lord, she's gone and died right on two little ducks. The comment travelled the hall faster than the number itself. Whispers, not altogether respectful, rose and collided, and in moments the bingo had disintegrated into a small civic forum of speculation. Some looked stricken, others relieved, as though an awkward social debt had been cancelled. Mr. Brindle, the hall caretaker, who possessed the physique of a prematurely collapsed deck chair, waddled to the body with the solemnity of a man certain that this, at least, was beyond his job description. The caller, to his credit, attempted to maintain order by ringing the small brass bell provided for false claims of house. Its tinkling sounded painfully frivolous under the circumstances. No one present would later claim to have seen anything unusual in the moments before Mrs. Hartby's last cough. Indeed, her manner of leaving life seemed entirely in keeping with her manner of living it, abrupt, graceless, and faintly inconsiderate. She was not, it must be said, universally beloved. She had occupied the presidency of the Flaxborough Horticultural Ladies Association for 12 years, largely by means of a constitution that she alone claimed to understand, and had perfected the art of disapproving without speaking. Yet, when Dr. Hargreaves, fetched from his nearby surgery, bent over the body and frowned at the lips, turned faintly blue, he muttered something that cut through even Mrs. Flitch's commentary. Not natural, not at all natural. That was the moment the bingo ceased to be an evening's entertainment and became, in the minds of its attendees, an event of some consequence. Within the hour, by means of telephones, bicycles, and one resolutely talkative constable, the whole town was aware that Ursula Hartby had died, and more to the point, had possibly been helped to die. At the police station, Inspector Purbright received the news with the same tranquil gravity he brought to all human affairs, whether burglary, barmaid dispute, or, as now seemed possible, murder. He closed the file he had been annotating, a case concerning the disappearance of 2 municipal spades, and remarked to Sergeant Malley, "Mrs. Hartby has interrupted bingo. We had better find out why." And with that simple declaration, Flaxborough's quiet routines began to shift ever so slightly under the weight of whispered conjecture and the promise of scandal, By the following morning, Ursula Hartby's departure from the bingo hall had grown in narrative detail with every telling. Few events in Flaxborough were more reliably embroidered than those that contained a whisper of impropriety, and death in a public place, accompanied by speculation of poison, was not destined to remain a simple medical matter. The town seemed to apply to scandal the same industriousness it reserved for jammicking and parish fundraisers. Mrs. Flitch, who had been nearest to the deceased, and had therefore acquired, in her own estimation, the right of senior witness, told no fewer than 3 versions of events before breakfast. In the cooperative bakery queue, she insisted Mrs. Hartby had clutched her throat, her eyes rolling dramatically, like a tragedienne on the stage. To Mr. Pottle, who sold her newspapers with deliberate slowness, confided that Ursula had muttered a final word, something resembling ginger. By the time she encountered the postman, she had added a detail about a peculiar smell of almonds, which, she hinted darkly, everyone knew was significant. It had been years since anyone in Flaxborough had studied chemistry, but vague half-memories of detective novels proved more than sufficient to confirm the almond aroma as a sign of wickedness. Sergeant Malley, a conscientious young man with an unfortunate tendency to believe the last person he spoke to, had already filled a notebook with contradictory statements by the time Inspector Purbright arrived at the station. He reported that one witness claimed Mrs. Hartby had collapsed with a sigh, another that she had shrieked, and yet another that she had gone quietly, like an elderly hen on a warm afternoon. Purbright, hearing these variations, merely nodded. Experience had taught him that in Flaxborough the truth was seldom half so vivid as the gossip it inspired. The inspector strolled to the public rooms in the early light, his measured tread accompanied by the faint echo of sparrows scolding in the eaves. Outside, 2 ladies of the Horticultural Association were already stationed on the steps like sentinels, discussing in tones that carried across the square whether it would be suitable to cancel next week's bulb lecture in respect of their late president. Purbright inclined his head politely, but did not pause. Their conversation was valuable not for accuracy but for atmosphere already. One could sense the shifts of power and influence that accompany any sudden vacancy in small-town committees. Inside, the bingo hall bore few marks of the drama. The caretaker, Mr. Brindle, had returned the chairs to their original order and swept the floor with a vigour suggesting relief that death left less debris than confetti. Only a faint scuff on the lino betrayed where the doctor's bag had stood. Purbright inspected the caller's platform, noting the neat array of wooden balls and the bell, which, the young man had confessed, he had rung in panic when Mrs. Hartby had collapsed. It seemed, thought Purbright, an oddly frivolous instrument in a scene of mortality, rather like sounding a triangle at a funeral. As he left, he was intercepted by the Reverend Hoole, curate of St. Swithin's, who looked both troubled and opportunistic. The Reverend observed that Mrs. Hartby had been a staunch, if overbearing member of his mother's circle, and that her death was not only a personal loss, but also, he hinted, with a gravity that failed to conceal eagerness, a matter likely to bring more of the flock into church pews in search of consolation. Purbright listened with his customary patience, filing away the knowledge that the late lady's influence had extended beyond begonias and into pew politics. By mid-afternoon, the Flaxborough Citizen appeared with its first cautious headline, "Sudden Death at Bingo Police Inquiries Continue." The editor, a man of sober caution, had nevertheless permitted himself a subheading that whispered, "Unnatural causes not ruled out." That line was read aloud in a dozen tea shops, provoking speculation ranging from rat poison slipped into sandwiches to exotic foreign powders introduced under cover of applause. One customer at the Dog and Whistle went so far as to declare that espionage could not be discounted. His audience, it should be said, found this less entertaining than the notion that Mrs. Hartby had finally succumbed to years of bottled disapproval. At Mrs. Cottam's drapery, 2 assistants whispered that the deceased had long been in dispute with a fellow horticulturalist over the judging of chrysanthemums. In the hairdresser's, the tale took a different course. A customer swore that Ursula had once been observed entering the back door of a solicitor's office, and surely such clandestine errands pointed to secret wills, quarrels over property, and motives dark enough for murder. Thus, by the time evening drew in, the town possessed not one but a dozen entirely distinct explanations for what had occurred, none of them tested against anything so mundane as fact. Purbright, meanwhile, sat in his office considering the more prosaic evidence. The doctor's statement had been firm, the sudden discoloration, the nature of the cough, the abrupt collapse all inconsistent with heart failure or a simple seizure. Something foreign had entered Mrs. Hartby's system. Poison, almost certainly. The question was whether by her own hand or another's. Purbright reflected that Flaxborough, despite its appearance of serenity, harboured a remarkable quantity of resentment per square yard. One did not remain president of any society for 12 years without generating opponents. He remembered Mrs. Hartby's glance at last year's flower show, when a rival's dahlias had inexplicably failed to bloom, triumph barely concealed beneath sanctimony. Few women forgot such things. Mally appeared at the door, cap in hand, with the latest account from Mrs. Flitch. It appeared she now recalled that Mrs. Hartby had borrowed a thermos from the refreshment table, muttering about a sore throat. Purbright suppressed a smile. Only yesterday, the same witness had asserted that Ursula had nothing with her but a handbag. He instructed the sergeant to collect the thermos and whatever remained of its contents. Whether truth or embroidery, the detail deserved attention. As darkness settled, the bingo hall incident had ceased to be merely an interruption of leisure. It had become the fabric of the town's conversation, a tapestry woven from speculation, prejudice, and just enough plausibility to keep tongues wagging. In the snug of the Bell and Bottle, where the landlord discreetly topped up glasses each time the subject was raised, one wag remarked that Ursula had finally managed to secure a full house in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The laughter that followed was edged with unease, for beneath the jokes lay the certainty that something sinister had intruded upon their routines. Inspector Purbright, walking home past the curtained windows and the hum of wireless sets, allowed himself one private reflection. Gossip might be inaccurate, but it was rarely irrelevant. Each embellishment hinted at what the town found credible, what it feared, and whom it distrusted. And somewhere, amid the laughter, the muttering, and the indignation, would lie the thread that led to the truth. He would only need patience, and in Flaxborough, patience was never in short supply. By the next morning, the gossip had reached such a pitch that Inspector Purbright judged it prudent to begin the most elementary of inquiries, not for the sake of immediate illumination, but to prevent the town from supplying its own conclusions before the police had managed to form any. He knew from experience that in Flaxborough, once a theory settled into common acceptance, it took on the durability of granite and was far more difficult to shift than any official statement could hope to be. He began, in the most deliberate fashion, with the caller of the fatal evening. Young Edgar Prout was found in the back room of the electrical shop, engaged in what might have been stock-taking had he not appeared to be counting the same box of light bulbs for the 3rd time. His nervousness was of the sort that confuses guilt with embarrassment, and Purbright's calm presence did nothing to lessen it. Edgar insisted that he had noticed nothing unusual before Mrs. Hartby's collapse, though he was swift to add that the deceased had been in unusually good spirits, almost jocular. This last comment seemed less an observation than a contribution to the growing myth of the event, and Purbright merely made a note of it without betraying either credence or doubt. From the bingo caller to the caretaker was a natural progression, and Mr. Brindle received him with the despondent courtesy of one who has too often been told that nothing ever goes right under his supervision. Brindle was a man who treated every occurrence as a personal reproach, and the death in his hall seemed to weigh upon him as though it had been caused by a draught from an ill-fitting window. He recounted, in minute detail, the precise timing of his broomings and dustings with an insistence that nothing suspicious had been left behind by his hand. He did, however, recall seeing Mrs. Hartby in conversation with a woman at the refreshment table made a remark, which, though offered with the air of triviality, was sufficient to redirect Purbright's path. That path led him, inevitably, to Mrs. Flitch. She was discovered standing guard at her front gate, evidently in order not to miss an audience. It was a warm day, but she wore a coat that suggested she feared sudden snow. To Purbright's opening inquiry, she responded with a flood of detail so abundant that the inspector could scarcely locate the question he had asked within it. She spoke of the cough, the colour of Ursula's handbag, the peculiar manner in which her stockings wrinkled at the ankle, and, after some diversion upon the failings of modern detergents, returned abruptly to the almonds. Purbright allowed her monologue to run until it reached the point where she described how she had noticed a smear upon the rim of the thermos cup. At this, he raised his eyes and, with gentle curiosity, asked what colour the smear had been. Mrs. Flitch looked stricken, as though confronted with an examination question outside the syllabus, and faltered. It might have been pink, or possibly brownies. Brown seemed more likely. Purbright thanked her with such grave civility that she at once felt confirmed as a witness of extraordinary reliability. The thermos itself had by then been retrieved and delivered to the station. Its contents, a residue of a liquid that smelt faintly medicinal, were dispatched to the county laboratory. Purbright did not expect swift enlightenment from that direction, but the gesture would serve to reassure both the coroner and the public that science, however long delayed, was assisting justice. In truth, he trusted rather more to human frailty than to chemical formulae. His next conversation took place in the parlour of Dr. Hargreaves, who looked faintly annoyed at being asked to repeat what he had already put in writing. Doctors, in Purbright's view, were curiously blind to the possibility that the spoken word often revealed more than the official statement. Hargreaves admitted that the symptoms had suggested poisoning, but declined to specify a substance. Pressed gently, he remarked that the suddenness pointed to something fast-acting, possibly a cyanide compound. He added with a shrug that implied both resignation and relief that Mrs. Hartby had made no shortage of enemies, though mostly of the sort that preferred snubbing her at tea rather than dispatching her with poison. Purbright nodded, thanked him, and left the doctor to his newspaper, satisfied that the man had said more than he realized. It was becoming clear that Ursula's prominence in the Horticultural Ladies Association demanded exploration. Purbright accordingly arranged to call upon Mrs. Mounts, the association's vice-president, and, by whispered consensus, the likeliest candidate to succeed her. Mrs. Mounts received him in a drawing-room that smelt strongly of lavender polish and faintly of concealed resentment. She professed the greatest sorrow at the sudden passing of her colleague, though she could not prevent her lips from twitching at the corners in what might have been interpreted as anticipation. When asked whether Mrs. Hartby had enjoyed cordial relations with her fellow members, Mrs. Mounts's expression assumed that of a woman confronted with a dishonest fruiterer. Ursula, she admitted, had sometimes been firm. When pressed for examples, she cited the occasion when Mrs. Hartby had refused to allow the substitution of carnations for roses in the annual parade, describing the suggestion as vulgar. She also mentioned, with reluctant satisfaction, that several members had resigned over the years rather than endure her inflexibility. Such details were not yet evidence, but they formed the backdrop against which motives might be painted. By the close of the day, Purbright had accumulated a notebook thick with contradictions. Ursula had been cheerful, and she had been morose. She had eaten nothing, yet she had sampled sandwiches she had spoken to nobody, and she had conversed at length with half the hall. All of it was, of course, possible. What remained certain was only that she had drunk from the thermos and shortly afterwards ceased to live. Beyond that, certainty dissolved into the fog of recollection and invention that hung perpetually over Flaxborough like a domestic smog. Back at the station, Malley presented his Sergeant's Digest of Witness Accounts, laid out with the conscientiousness of one who hoped his superior would find order where he himself could not. Purbright studied it, not to resolve the contradictions, but to see which had the ring of convenience. Lies, in his view, often revealed themselves not by implausibility, but by comfort. He noted with interest that several witnesses had volunteered, unasked, that they themselves had provided Ursula with nothing to eat or drink. The inspector considered this a little too emphatic. Innocence, he mused, seldom feels obliged to underline itself. The evening settled into quiet paperwork. Outside, the street lamps flickered into amber life, and the town resumed its untroubled routines. Yet in the silence of his office, Purbright reflected upon one unshakable truth. If Ursula Hartby had indeed been murdered, the motive would not be hidden in chemistry, but in character. Somewhere among the small jealousies, the bruised prides, the thwarted ambitions of Flaxborough society, lay the impulse strong enough to turn irritation into poison. It was his task, as ever, to distinguish malice from mere habit, and in this town he thought habit could often look uncommonly like malice. The following day found Inspector Purbright in the unaccustomed position of being urged towards swiftness. Normally Flaxborough preferred its constabulary to exercise discretion chiefly in the form of delay, reasoning that most troubles, left alone, collapsed under their own weight. On this occasion, however, the clamour for a conclusion came from quarters that enjoyed both influence and anxiety. The coroner, receiving pressure from the editor of the Citizen, had remarked that a public inquest would be troublesome unless the police provided at least the outline of a culprit. Councillor Copeland, whose business empire included both the bingo concessions and the refreshment contracts, was less oblique. He requested, in tones of righteous indignation, that the inspector clear this matter up quickly before the hall is associated with scandal. It was at this juncture that attention began to settle upon a single figure, Miss Cora Cribble. She had been one of the last people seen in conversation with Ursula Hartby on the fatal night, and, more damning in the eyes of her peers, she was known to have lost a bitter contest within the Horticultural Ladies Association just 2 years earlier. The subject had been nothing more momentous than the colour scheme of the summer flower beds outside the town library, but Miss Cribble had argued her case for marigolds with such persistence that Mrs. Hartby's eventual triumph in favour of pink begonias was regarded as a defeat of character rather than of blooms. Since then, the two women had exchanged the kind of politeness reserved for tax demands, formal, unavoidable, and faintly venomous. Purbright first encountered Miss Cribble at her front garden, where she was engaged in pruning rose bushes with more energy than precision. She was a spinster of wiry frame and unflinching eye, the sort of woman who seemed always on the verge of reprimanding either a neighbour or Providence. When Purbright, with his usual mild courtesy, inquired whether she recalled her last words with the deceased, Miss Cribble replied at once, "I told her she'd live to regret her obstinacy, though it seems she didn't live long enough." It was the sort of remark that, when repeated in the snug of a public house, took on the hue of a confession. The inspector did not trouble to correct her choice of words. Instead, he asked about the thermos. At this, Miss Cribble looked briefly triumphant. She declared that she had warned Ursula against those revolting herbal concoctions she was forever sipping, remarking that such things were bound to make her ill sooner or later. Purbright observed quietly that few herbal infusions acted so decisively. She gave him a sharp glance, then returned to pruning, snipping viciously at a perfectly innocent branch. It was enough. By tea-time, rumour had done the rest. Miss Cribble's unfortunate phrase was circulated with gleeful accuracy. At the dog and whistle, men smacked their palms on tables and said, "There you are, clear as day." At the drapery, Mrs. Cottam confided to a favoured customer that she had always suspected Cora Cribble of going too far. By evening, the town had decided it would be fitting for the police to remove her forthwith. That the inspector hadn't done so was interpreted as either gallantry or incompetence. Sergeant Malley, with youthful earnestness, presented the case to Purbright in what he imagined was a tone of professional firmness. He pointed out the quarrel, the opportunity, the ill-judged remark, and the absence of any alibi other than Miss Cribble's own word. He even suggested, with an air of reluctant daring, that they might at least interview her under caution. Purbright listened with grave attention, nodding from time to time as though weighing the proposal against a solemn standard known only to him. "Sergeant," he said at length, "you will find that the obvious often satisfies everybody except the truth." Malley coloured slightly, but persisted that at least the councillors and public would feel reassured by decisive action. Purbright gave a small sigh, the sort that indicated no irritation, but rather the eternal patience of a man accustomed to explaining that the earth continues to orbit the sun despite all appearances to the contrary. It was, however, convenient to allow the town to settle upon a suspect. For while all eyes and tongues pointed accusingly at Cora Cribble, other possibilities might be examined in relative calm. Purbright therefore encouraged his sergeant to gather every statement concerning her words and movements, all duly logged and signed, and left the matter to ferment. He was content to let suspicion ripen, knowing it often produced, by over-ripening, the seeds of contradiction. Meanwhile, Cora herself seemed disinclined to moderation. She informed anyone within earshot that she had been persecuted for years by Mrs. Hartby's tyranny, and that her present notoriety was only proof that Flaxborough preferred tyranny to truth. Such pronouncements, far from clearing her, only deepened the colour of suspicion. One could almost see the townsfolk licking their lips at the prospect of a woman they had long disliked finally being carted off by the police. But Purbright, in his calm, unworried manner, kept his attention elsewhere. He revisited the bingo hall, noting the careful arrangement of cups at the refreshment table, and spoke again with the caretaker, who now recalled that after Ursula's collapse, someone had tidied away the remaining sandwiches with remarkable speed. He was not able to say who, but Purbright wrote it down all the same. He then sought out the vicar, who observed that Mrs. Hartby had been particularly scathing of late about a parishioner's moral lapses of phrase, which, once shared in whispers, might encompass anything from a second slice of cake to adultery. Purbright made no judgment, but he noted with interest that the vicar had been quick to mention names of those most publicly at odds with Ursula, none of them Miss Cribble. By the week's end, the county laboratory telephoned with confirmation the residue in the thermos contained cyanide. The news, once known, spread like spilled ink. Every household recalled something: an open bottle in a shed, a whiff of insecticide, a box of rat poison from years gone by. The practicalities of cyanide's presence mattered less than its melodrama. For Flaxborough, the word itself was enough to colour every conversation with menace. The bingo hall ceased to be merely unlucky. It became, in rumour's hands, the scene of deliberate cold-blooded murder. This naturally emboldened those who demanded Miss Cribble's arrest. Here was the means, they argued, motive and malice proven, and surely the inspector must now act. Yet Purbright remained serenely unmoved. He went about his inquiries with the same unhurried courtesy as before, leaving the town to its delicious certainty. Those who looked closely at him, though, might have noticed in his eyes a mild gleam of amusement, as though he had already discerned that the solution lay not with the obvious, but with something yet to be noticed, something trivial perhaps, but decisive. By the time suspicion had all but cemented itself around Miss Cribble, Inspector Purbright had begun to cultivate a different curiosity. It did not concern the dramatic, for which the town had a hearty appetite, but rather the quietly peculiar fragments of detail that most people overlooked precisely because they seemed unworthy of notice. Purbright had long observed that in Flaxborough, large events usually grew from very small seeds, often no more impressive than a misplaced umbrella or an untimely remark. One such fragment arose when he asked Sergeant Malley to review once more the arrangements of the refreshment table on the night of the bingo. Malley, who prided himself on accurate recall when food was involved, described how the sandwiches had been cut into neat triangles, how the buns had been dusted with sugar, and how the cups were stacked in 2 uneven columns. It was at this point he mentioned, with the casualness of a man who considered it irrelevant, that one of the cups bore a faint smear of lipstick, an orange shade, unusual in its brightness compared with the modest pinks favoured by Flaxborough matrons. He recalled it only because it had clashed with the pallor of tea within. Purbright made no show of interest, but he underlined the note in his pad. Later, when reviewing witness statements, he noticed that none had described Mrs. Hartby as wearing lipstick at all. Ursula had prided herself on a natural look, which in practice meant a complexion unassisted by cosmetics. The presence of lipstick, therefore, suggested that someone else had drunk from the same cupboard, perhaps that Ursula's fatal mouthful had not come from her own vessel at all. Another detail, equally small, emerged from a conversation with Mr. Brindle, who had continued to treat the tragedy as a blemish upon his janitorial record. In a bid to absolve himself, he explained how, after the doctor's pronouncement, he had found himself tidying the refreshment table. He remembered stacking the plates and wiping crumbs, but what stayed in his mind was an annoyance. One of the napkins had been carelessly discarded on a chair rather than in the bin. He recalled it because it bore an odd little sketch someone had idly doodled the outline of a house, complete with chimney smoke. Brindle had been tempted to throw it away, but decided it might later be demanded as evidence, so he had stuffed it into his pocket. With a groan, he produced it from a drawer in his lodge, where it had languished beside a ball of string and a bent teaspoon. Purbright examined the napkin. The doodle itself was nothing remarkable, but the initials EP were scrawled in the corner. That, of course, matched Edgar Prout, the nervous bingo caller. The inspector asked Mr. Brindle why he had not mentioned this earlier. Brindle protested that he had not thought of a childish sketch on a napkin worth troubling the police about. Purbright did not rebuke him. In Flaxborough, he reflected, it was often those trifles that explained what the town itself tried hardest to ignore. When Purbright next saw Edgar, he produced the napkin. The young man flushed scarlet and stammered that he must have scribbled absent-mindedly while waiting to begin the evening's game. He was certain he had done nothing wrong. He had no idea how the napkin had wandered to a chair. Purbright let the matter rest with a nod, but the sergeant, once Edgar had departed, whispered darkly that it proved intent. Purbright, smiling faintly, remarked that it proved only impatience. Yet the thermos, the cup, and the lipstick trace remained in his mind. It was possible that Ursula Hartby had not been the intended victim at all, or that she had been handed a cup meant for another. The idea, faint but insistent, nagged at him, and he began to ask questions of a different sort, not who disliked Ursula, for that was a catalogue without end, but who else might have been present, vulnerable and worth removing. The answer came in hints. Reverend Hoole, in his unctuous fashion, revealed that Mrs. Hartby had been preparing to make certain disclosures at the next Mothers' Circle meeting. He would not elaborate, but his unease betrayed the nature of those disclosures, and gossip sharpened into weaponry. Then Mrs. Mounce, when pressed about the vice-presidency, confessed that Ursula had threatened to denounce her as morally unfit, though for what particular failing she would not specify. These remarks suggested that Ursula's role had been not merely officious, but actively threatening to reputations. It was easy to imagine someone deciding that prevention was safer than exposure. At this stage, however, all such possibilities rested upon the smallest of observations. Without the lipstick smear, without the misplaced napkin, without Brindle's memory of sandwiches and tidied cups, the case remained what the town preferred, a tidy morality play with Miss Cribble as villain. But Purbright was not content with neatness. He preferred accuracy, however ungainly it looked. On Friday evening, as he strolled past the public rooms, he noticed the lamps burning inside. A committee meeting was in progress, the hastily convened Horticultural Association, debating succession in Ursula's absence. Through the door came the muffled tones of Mrs. Mounce, expounding at great length upon continuity and stability. Purbright, pausing in the shadows, observed who else attended. Among them was Edgar Prout, present to record minutes. It struck him as curious what interest the young man had in flower shows and bulb selections, unless perhaps he was tied to one of the ladies more closely than was generally known. That evening he reviewed his notes again. Cyanide introduced via a thermos, a cup with lipstick not belonging to the victim, a doodled napkin with initials, a hall full of people, any one of whom might have been the intended or accidental target, and a town that, in its hunger for certainty, had already chosen its scapegoat. He set down his pen and sat back, gazing at the familiar walls of his office. Somewhere among these trifles the truth waited. It was his task to decide which of them were accidental litter, and which, like the crumbs of a meal, pointed unmistakably to the source. Inspector Purbright was never a man to allow the town to narrow his enquiry before the evidence itself had done so. Though Miss Cribble remained, in the public imagination, already half convicted and ready for transportation, he chose to widen his view. The trivial clues, the lipstick, the doodled napkin, had unsettled the comfortable picture that gossip had painted. If one wished to understand a crime in Flaxborough, one had to look at the entire social tapestry, threads of petty grievance woven tighter than any constable's report could show. He began with Mrs. Gedge, the widow who oversaw the bingo hall's refreshment table. She lived in a narrow terrace where curtains were permanently drawn against imagined draughts. Her memory was sharp where food was concerned. She knew exactly how many ham sandwiches she had prepared, precisely how many buns had been dusted, and to whom she had handed the first teapot. When asked whether she had noticed Ursula Hartby's thermos, she sniffed that it was like the woman to distrust communal tea. Then, lowering her voice, she remarked that Ursula had been seen whispering with Councillor Copeland in the weeks before her death. Mrs. Gedge claimed no knowledge of their subject, but she assured Purbright it was not about begonias. The inspector thanked her gravely, knowing well that the phrase would echo in half a dozen kitchens before supper. Councillor Copeland, confronted in his office above the furniture showroom, was keen to display both outrage and innocence. He insisted his dealings with Ursula had been purely in her capacity as an association president petitioning for funds. When pressed, he admitted, reluctantly, that she had hinted at possessing knowledge of certain irregularities in the bingo accounts. Copeland assured the inspector, with a confidence rather too polished, that the accounts were beyond reproach. Purbright, who had observed enough council bookkeeping to know otherwise, noted the man's anxiety but gave no sign of judgment. He left Copeland, gazing nervously from his office window as though already seeing headlines in bold type. The circle widened further at the solicitor's, where Mr. Willard received the inspector with a dry cough and the air of a man resigned to others' misdeeds. Yes, Mrs. Hartby had indeed consulted him recently. Yes, it concerned a will, though professional discretion prevented detail. Pressed with Purbright's patient silence, Willard conceded that Ursula had wished to disinherit a nephew who, in her words, had turned disreputable. The solicitor would not name the nephew, but Purbright suspected that in a town the size of Flaxborough, the name would find him soon enough without help. It did, later that afternoon, at the Bell and Bottle. There, the inspector overheard two tradesmen muttering about young Derek Hartby, who had lately taken to motorcycles late nights, and the sort of employment that began in betting shops and ended in bankruptcy. Derek, it seemed, had no fondness for his aunt, and had once described her, with adolescent venom, as a dragon. That she had considered cutting him off came as no surprise to her neighbours, who agreed that Ursula had always been parsimonious with affection as well as with money. Even so, Purbright knew better than to confuse motive with action. Half the town had reasons to resent Ursula. It was the means that mattered who had both access and confidence to slip poison into a thermos and ensure it reached her lips. He carried that question into every conversation, listening not for facts but for tones, the pause that betrayed anxiety, the over-eager denial, the righteous indignation that sounded rehearsed. One such tone reached him at the drapery, where Mrs. Cottam, the proprietor, leaned across her counter and declared that Ursula had quarrelled bitterly with Mrs. Mounce only days before her death. The subject, predictably, had been in control of the association. It was no ordinary disagreement, Mrs. Cottam insisted. It was a war. She described how Ursula had threatened to expose her vice-president unless she withdrew from standing again. Purbright asked, in his mildest manner, what sort of exposure was implied. Mrs. Cottam pursed her lips and said nothing, which in Flaxborough was as eloquent as any confession. Thus the inspector's notebook grew heavy with possibilities: a counsellor, anxious about accounts, a solicitor bound by discretion but hinting at family strife, a nephew in danger of disinheritance, a rival in fear of scandal. Each was plausible, each was flavoured by resentment, yet none stood clear. He walked home that evening through streets where curtains twitched as he passed, aware that the town was already writing its own verdicts. At the station, Sergeant Malley brought him the latest laboratory note, cyanide confirmed, and in a quantity that left no doubt of intent. Malley was flushed with excitement, convinced that the circle had narrowed upon Miss Cribble. He pointed again to her unfortunate words about Ursula, living or not living enough. Purbright listened, then asked quietly whether the sergeant had noticed the colour of her lipstick. Malley, baffled, admitted he had not. The inspector closed his notebook with a faint smile. That, he said, is why we must continue to look. For all the town's eagerness to simplify, Purbright found the pattern widening, not closing. It was as if Ursula Hartby's death had loosed a flood of grievances long dammed, each neighbour rushing to hint that they too had suffered under her tyranny. What interested him most was not the grievances themselves that were common currency in Flaxborough, but the urgency with which people insisted upon their own innocence. The louder the denial, he reflected, the nearer one often was to the truth. And so while the town slept content with its scapegoat, Inspector Purbright prepared himself to explore further. The lipstick, the doodled napkin, The whispered threats were still no more than fragments. Yet fragments, fitted patiently together, could form a picture large enough to show the guilty face. He reminded himself, as he extinguished his lamp, that in Flaxborough the face was rarely the one the town expected. Inspector Purbright was not, by temperament, inclined to hurry his inquiries. He preferred the slow accumulation of circumstance to the swift leap at conclusion, and Flaxborough provided him with no shortage of circumstance. Yet it was not his patience but fortune that altered the course of the case. For another incident occurred that shifted suspicion in a manner no constable's logic could have managed. It began on a Monday evening, 3 days after Ursula Hartby's funeral had been conducted with more curiosity than grief. The Horticultural Ladies Association, refusing to postpone indefinitely its pressing business of succession, gathered in the parish rooms under Mrs. Mounce's brittle chairmanship. The meeting was to have been a quiet one, attended chiefly by those who wished to make certain of their position in the reshaped hierarchy. But before the second item on the agenda had been reached, one of the members, Mrs. Roper, excused herself in some agitation, complaining of a sudden dizziness. She had scarcely crossed the floor before her knees buckled, and she collapsed, striking the edge of a trestle table with a force that scattered seed catalogues like startled pigeons. The immediate assumption was fainting. There was clamour for windows to be opened, and cries for smelling salts. But when the doctor arrived, and this time it was Dr. Hargreaves's assistant, a conscientious young man who lacked his senior's detachment, he announced, with solemnity, sharpened by inexperience, that the woman showed signs not of faintness, but of poisoning. She was removed to hospital, where her condition remained uncertain, though the doctor ventured to say her life was not in danger. The effect upon the town was explosive. In the snug of the Bell and Bottle, it was declared a miracle that she had survived what must surely be the same poison that had carried off Ursula. At the cooperative, queues buzzed with theories, clearly that someone was now bent on removing the entire leadership of the Horticultural Association. For Purbright, the incident was significant less for its drama than for its consequence. It dislodged the convenient suspicion of Miss Cribble, for even the most eager tongues admitted she could hardly have contrived both deaths, particularly as she hadn't been present at the meeting, having ostentatiously boycotted it in protest at what she called shameless ambition. If Ursula's death had been murder, it was no longer the act of a solitary, embittered rival, but part of a pattern that touched several lives. Purbright attended the parish rooms the following morning. The seed catalogues still lay in mild disorder, their illustrations of prize leeks and gaudy dahlias oddly grotesque under the circumstances. Mrs. Mounce, pale but determined, declared that the association would not be cowed. She hinted darkly that some outside influence was at work, perhaps even a man. When asked what Mrs. Roper had consumed before her collapse, she admitted with reluctance that the refreshments had included tea served from a communal pot. There had been no thermos this time. Yet one cup, she recalled, had carried a faint bitterness which its drinker had remarked upon before putting it down. Unfortunately, she could not recall whether this had been Mrs. Roper's cup or another's. The vagueness, Purbright reflected, was less suspicious than inevitable. People rarely noticed what mattered most until it was too late. What was clear was that a second poisoning, however mild, changed the entire complexion of affairs. The laboratory confirmed traces of the same substance, cyanide, though in smaller doses. Whether this suggested caution on the part of the poisoner or clumsiness was unclear. What mattered was that Ursula Hartby's death could no longer be dismissed as either an accident or isolated malice. There was unmistakably an attempt to strike again. This revelation unsettled more than the gossipers. Councillor Copeland, whose voice had earlier rung loud in calls for swift justice, now grew subdued. He muttered about his responsibilities to the community and the danger of attendance falling at the bingo if confidence were not restored. Purbright listened, his expression politely blank, while noting the man's nervous hands and the sheen of sweat on his brow. Meanwhile, Mr. Willard, the solicitor, sent word that he wished to clarify his previous statement Ursula had indeed intended alterations to her will, but he now recalled she had also mentioned confidential papers stored in her house. These, he hinted, might concern more than family. Purbright accepted the news without surprise. The solicitor's memory, like many in Flaxborough, was peculiarly responsive to fresh alarms. The inspector allowed himself privately a small measure of satisfaction. The second incident had widened the field in a way his own questions could not have managed. Where before suspicion had narrowed uncomfortably upon one quarrelsome spinster, it now spread across a group of individuals, each of whom might have reason to dread exposure by Ursula Hartby or her circle. The crime was no longer petty jealousy, it had acquired the air of calculation. That evening, as he walked home, Purbright passed two men outside the tobacconist, deep in discussion. "Mark my words," one was saying, "it'll be a lot of horticultural women. Something nasty is going on there." The other nodded, clearly relieved to place the menace in a compartment labelled "Other People." Purbright, with the faintest twitch of amusement, considered how eagerly the town shifted blame in order to protect its own calm. It was a useful instinct in the very act of denying involvement. People often revealed their fears. He knew the coming days would require him to look more closely, not at Ursula herself, but at those who had feared her influence, her disclosures, or her control. The lipstick smear, the doodled napkin, the whisper of scandal, all these now assumed sharper meaning when placed beside a second poisoning. He suspected the town would continue to feed upon speculation, but he had no intention of allowing speculation to govern the inquiry. Patiently, politely, he would draw each thread together until the web revealed its centre. And somewhere, behind the facade of respectability, someone in Flaxborough was already wondering whether they had tried once too often and failed. Inspector Purbright had long believed that crimes in Flaxborough were less the product of cunning than of temperament. Malice here was seldom grand or exotic. It tended instead to grow from the cramped soil of envy, humiliation, or resentment, and flowered in the small, hot houses of committee rooms and parlours. As he walked through the town after the second incident, he found himself reflecting not on cyanide or cups, but on the unchanging rhythms of human frailty that provided such fertile ground for mischief. The town itself seemed to echo his thoughts. Its people went about their routines with outward calm, yet beneath the surface, nervous glances and hurried whispers betrayed the unease that spread like damp through brickwork. The second poisoning had unsettled the balance. It was one thing for Ursula Hartby, notorious for her sharp tongue and rigid authority, to die in circumstances that could be construed as fitting. But when Mrs. Roper collapsed, a woman regarded as harmlessly fussy and entirely unthreatening, the comfortable narrative wobbled. If such a person could be struck, who might be next? Suspicion, once concentrated on Miss Cribble, now fluttered over a wider field, touching councillors, nephews and vice-presidents in equal measure. Purbright considered each of them in turn. Councillor Copeland, anxious about his bingo accounts, was a man accustomed to authority but not to challenge. Ursula had threatened to expose him. Perhaps Mrs. Roper, too, had been indiscreetly observant. Then there was Mrs. Mounts, who hovered between relief at her rival's demise and terror of her own exposure. She was not a woman of courage, yet desperation often lent people a daring they would otherwise lack. Derek Hartby, the nephew, loomed in the background, careless, reckless, perhaps capable of panic, but scarcely of planning. And Edgar Prout, the young bingo caller with the nervous manner and the doodled napkin remained curiously lodged in the inspector's thoughts. He seemed too timid for violence, yet timid men sometimes acted rashly when drawn into other people's quarrels. As these figures arranged themselves in Purbright's mind, he found his attention returning again and again to trivialities. The lipstick on the cup, the napkin with initials, the rapid tidying of sandwiches each seemed too small to matter, yet together they whispered of design. He knew from experience that murder in Flaxborough was rarely accomplished with sophistication. It was almost always untidy, marked by overlooked details and betrayed by a telltale gesture. What intrigued him was not whether someone had poisoned Ursula that much, the laboratory confirmed, but whether she had truly been the intended victim. The possibility that another had been meant to drink from the fatal cup shadowed his reflections. At the station, Sergeant Malley remained impatient. He was eager for arrests, for statements to be typed and charges laid. To him, the second incident merely proved that a dangerous poisoner was at large, and that decisive action was overdue. Purbright listened without reproach, for he valued the young man's diligence, even while discounting his conclusions. The difficulty, he told him gently, is not deciding who might have wished Mrs. Hartby harm. It is deciding who wished it so very particularly that they would risk their own neck to see it done. Malley frowned, unconsoled, and returned to his papers with the air of a man who believed his superior to be indulgent rather than profound. That evening, alone in his office, Purbright allowed himself a longer meditation. He thought of Ursula herself, her presidency of the association, her threats, her disapproval. It was tempting to imagine that her death was the culmination of years of enmity, that resentment had boiled over into action. Yet Ursula had lived with enemies for years. Why now? Why in such a public setting? And why by means of a thermos that drew attention to itself instead of something subtler? He suspected that the explanation lay not in Ursula's life, but in someone else's fear. She had threatened to speak, perhaps of financial irregularities, perhaps of moral failings, perhaps of family disgrace. In so doing, she had unsettled a delicate balance, and someone had acted to restore it by silencing her. Still, the presence of a second attempt suggested clumsiness. If Ursula had been the sole target, why strike again at Mrs. Roper, a woman of no consequence, unless, of course, Mrs. Roper had stumbled too close to the truth herself, or unless the poisoner, having failed to control events the first time, was attempting to reassert that control in panic. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers, and allowed the thought to hover. Panic, not calculation, might be the key. People in panic reached for obvious means and overlooked obvious traces donned by lipstick smears, discarded napkins, cups hastily moved. His reflections were interrupted by the clock chiming 9. The town outside was quiet, its lights dimmed, its routines resumed. Yet Purbright sensed the undercurrent of fear that now threaded through evening teas and bedtime prayers. He felt, as he often did, a faint sorrow that death, even when it came clothed in absurdity, disturbed so many lives with suspicion and unease. But he also felt the calm satisfaction of a man who trusted time and patience to unravel knots. Human nature, left long enough, seldom failed to reveal itself. Before leaving, he noted in his diary a single line: "The truth lies not with the loudest quarrels, but with the quietest cup." He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and stepped out into the cool night, where the cobbles shone faintly under the moon, and the town, for all its secrets, looked as still and respectable as ever. Inspector Purbright believed there were moments in an enquiry when direct confrontation only muddied the waters, while a carefully placed remark could clear them at once. He never aimed to trap so much as to unsettle, knowing that guilt betrayed itself not in words, but in the manner of their delivery. Having reflected upon the curious trifles of the case, the lipstick, the napkin, the rapid clearing away of the cup, she decided the time had come to set a quiet test. His opportunity presented itself at a small gathering arranged by the vicar in hopes of restoring calm. The Mothers' Circle had chosen to meet in the church hall under Reverend Hoole's earnest supervision, and several of the usual figures were present, eager both to demonstrate fortitude and to discover what their neighbours were saying. Purbright attended in a capacity that was both official and faintly social, exchanging polite greetings while watching the subtle choreography of glances and whispers. He knew the guilty person would not appear outwardly different, but he suspected a single stone, lightly dropped into the water, would reveal the ripples. When conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to the dreadful events at the bingo and the parish rooms, Purbright remarked in his mildest tone that the laboratory had discovered not only cyanide, but also traces of a cosmetic substance adhering to the rim of one cup. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the laboratory believed it could be traced to a particular brand of lipstick not sold locally. Then he changed the subject with courteous abruptness, asking whether the hall's heating had been repaired. To most of those present, the remark passed as a curiosity soon lost in the shuffle of complaints about drafts. To 3 people, however, it produced reactions worth noting. Mrs. Mounce, normally impervious in her self-control, glanced sharply at the vicar, then down at her handbag, as though checking an inventory she could not discuss. Councillor Copeland cleared his throat with unnecessary vigour and began an elaborate account of his latest civic project. And Edgar Prout, seated modestly at the edge, went pale enough to draw the sympathy of a neighbour who pressed a sweet into his hand. Purbright observed all 3, storing their discomfort without comment. He had not said the lipstick existed, only that the laboratory had identified it, and the knowledge that truth could not be distinguished from invention was often enough to shake the fragile. Later that evening, he called upon Edgar under the pretext of returning the doodled napkin which he now claimed the caretaker had wished to have back. The young man, visibly nervous, received him in a sitting-room furnished by a mother who had once subscribed to Woman's Weekly with evangelical zeal. Purbright spoke amiably of the challenges of calling numbers without error, then remarked casually that it must be difficult to concentrate when one's thoughts were occupied with other responsibilities. Edgar blinked, uncertain. The inspector added, such as keeping friends' confidences or perhaps offering small courtesies at the refreshment table. It was not an accusation but an invitation to betray anxiety. Edgar's eyes darted towards the kitchen, then back, and he muttered that he had done nothing wrong. Purbright patted his arm and took his leave, having learned more from the lad's panic than from any confession. The following day he repeated the method with Mrs. Mounce, calling upon her to inquire whether she intended to continue the association's flower show. She received him stiffly, her composure a fragile glaze over evident strain. Purbright spoke of Ursula's strictness in matters of floral display, then remarked gently that her insistence had extended even to her companion's appearance. "I understand," he said, "that she was sometimes critical of other ladies' use of cosmetics." The silence that followed was a taut string. Mrs. Mounce, after a pause, said coldly that Ursula had never approved of women attempting to look younger than they were. The inspector bowed his head in agreement, observing how her hand moved unconsciously to adjust the clasp of her handbag, which bore the faintest smear of orange powder near the fastening. It was not yet proof, but it was movement. The guilty mind, he knew, often betrayed itself by protesting too little, by diverting attention with irrelevance, or by rehearsed indignation. In Flaxborough, where gossip was the town's native language, the guilty always struggled with silence. Purbright's method was simply to provide them an opportunity to fill it. He allowed another day to pass, during which rumour swelled in town that the inspector had almost got his man. No one knew which man, or indeed whether it was a man at all, but the conviction lent a festive air to speculation. In the Bell and Bottle, Miss Cribble was observed lecturing anyone within earshot on the perils of trusting officials, while in the drapery, Mrs. Cottam announced with satisfaction that the inspector had finally looked in the right direction. Each was certain they themselves had never been under suspicion, a certainty that Purbright knew was as unreliable as any other. On Thursday, he took a second test. He invited Councillor Copeland to the station, ostensibly to review the safety arrangements for the bingo hall. While showing him the inspector's notebook, left open on the desk, Purbright allowed the councillor's eyes to stray upon a page where the words "financial motive," "embezzlement" were underlined. Copeland's colour deepened. He stammered that he had always been scrupulous, though no one had suggested otherwise. Purbright let him ramble, then closed the book gently as though satisfied. What mattered was not the words, but the man's urgency in denying them. He would not have to press the councillor, would now betray himself by over-defensiveness at every opportunity. These small probes, so quietly placed, had produced their effect. Of the many who had reason to dislike Ursula, 3 now stood out: a councillor nervous about exposure, a vice-president fearful of censure, and a young man whose panic suggested entanglement in matters beyond his capacity. The inspector had not yet chosen between them, but he was content. The guilty, he reflected, could be relied upon to hasten their own undoing if one gave them enough rope woven from nothing more threatening than a few politely misleading remarks. It was Purbright's habit to arrange his revelations not in courts or dramatic confrontations, but in rooms where the ordinary persisted the tick of a clock, the rustle of a curtain, the faint smell of polish. He believed truth, when it came, should be as unstartling as possible, for that was the only way people in Flaxborough could bear to accept it. Thus, when he invited several of the key figures to the police station one damp afternoon, it was under the pretext of reviewing evidence and clarifying minor points, not of accusation. Councillor Copeland arrived first, flustered, and carrying a sheaf of papers as though the weight of civic responsibility might shield him. Mrs. Mounts followed, her expression primly controlled, lips tight enough to suggest disapproval of the weather itself. Edgar Prout trailed in last, pale and twitchy, tugging at his cuffs as though he feared even his own shirt might betray him. Purbright greeted them with the quiet courtesy of a host rather than an officer. He poured tea, invited them to sit, and remarked upon the nuisance of leaks in the station roof. The suspects, for they were all suspects still, sipped cautiously, wondering why they had been drawn together. It was then, when they were lulled by mundanity, that Purbright began his explanation, his tone patient and almost conversational, as if he were merely clarifying parish minutes. He reminded them first of Ursula Hartby's position, formidable, officious, and above all, threatening. She had gathered knowledge of others' weaknesses and was not shy of using them. To Councillor Copeland, she hinted of financial irregularities to Mrs. Mounts. She suggested unfitness for office to her solicitor, and she had spoken of changes to her will. The town, Purbright observed, was content to believe she had died because she was disliked. Yet dislike alone rarely propelled anyone to such a decisive act. It was fear, not hatred, that poisoned a thermos. At this Mrs. Mounts shifted, setting down her cup with a click. Copeland cleared his throat. Edgar looked as though he wished to vanish behind the table. Purbright continued gently, noting that Ursula had brought to the bingo not only her dabber and her handbag, but also her threats. She had intended before long to disclose something at a public meeting. He suspected several of those present feared the moment. Then he turned to the details, each laid out as if he were arranging flowers. The thermos, carrying more than herbal infusion, the cup with the orange lipstick, a shade Ursula never wore, the napkin with Edgar's initials, found discarded after the panic, and finally the curious haste with which refreshments had been cleared when Ursula collapsed, as if someone sought to remove traces before questions could be asked. None of these things alone condemned together, they pointed out. It was not Ursula who had been meant to drink the fatal cup. That was the point on which Purbright dwelt, watching faces. The intended target had been someone who did wear lipstick, someone seated close enough that cups might be exchanged. He recalled how Mrs. Mounce, in her anxiety, had admitted Ursula disapproved of women who tried to look younger. It was she, not Ursula, who favoured the bright orange shade. The inspector allowed silence to settle on the room as the weight of implication grew. Mrs. Mounce gave a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. She protested that she had touched no cup but her own, that she could not imagine who would wish her harm. Yet her hand trembled as she adjusted her handbag, revealing again the faint trace of powder at the clasp. Purbright's voice remained calm as he suggested that the poison had been meant for her, not for Ursula, and that in the confusion of tea, poured and cups shifted, Ursula had taken it instead. He saw the flicker of relief in Copeland's eyes, swiftly masked, and knew it was confirmation. For who else but the counsellor, whose accounts Ursula threatened to expose, would have sought to silence the vice-president who might assist her? Purbright then spoke of panic. When Mrs. Roper collapsed days later, it was not part of the original plan but the result of a desperate attempt to finish what had failed. The second dose had been weaker, clumsier, as though the poisoner had lost nerve. The inspector turned to Edgar and observed that it must have been difficult for a young man, pressed into errands by his elders, to find himself caught in matters beyond his strength. Edgar flushed scarlet, stammering that he had only fetched cups, only tidied napkins, that he had done what he was told. Purbright placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said quietly that he believed him. The lad's doodle, the initials, were not the marks of guilt, but of nervous idleness. His panic was not the panic of a murderer, but of one who had been used. Finally, Purbright looked at Councillor Copeland. He spoke without anger, almost with sympathy, of the weight of civic pride, of the terror of disgrace, of the temptation to preserve reputation at any cost. Copeland began to protest, but his voice cracked, and the sheaf of papers in his hand shook like leaves. Purbright explained, with all the serenity of a man describing an unalterable fact, that the counsellor had access to the refreshments, that he had been seen conferring with Ursula, that he had the strongest motive of all. It was not rage that had guided his hand, but the cold fear of exposure. The poison, intended for Mrs. Mounce, who might have colluded in Ursula's revelation, had found its way instead to Ursula herself. Thus the counsellor had brought not silence, but chaos. The room was still. Mrs. Mounce's lips pressed together as if she would never again open them. Edgar stared at the tablecloth. Copeland sat slumped, his civic dignity crumbling like damp plaster. Purbright rose, gently signalling for Sergeant Malley to step forward. His tone remained kind, almost regretful, as he asked the counsellor to accompany them. "You see," he concluded softly, "in Flaxborough, reputation is never preserved by deceit, it is only postponed, and with that the truth, long clouded by gossip and speculation, settled quietly into the town's fabric, as inevitable as the ticking of the station clock." The arrest of Councillor Copeland did not, in the end, surprise Flaxborough quite as much as it should have done. Surprise, in fact, was a rare commodity in the town. People were generally far more astonished when nothing happened than when something did. Still, there was a certain relish in the discovery that a man who had presided so pompously over accounts, committees, and concessions had been quietly siphoning civic funds to support ventures more personal than municipal. The revelation of poisoning, though darker in tone, was received with the same curiosity as a new shop window display. It provided at least a week's solid discussion. Mrs. Flitch told and retold the tale of her eyewitness role until she had acquired the status of near heroine, though her version underwent alterations with each retelling. By the weekend she was insisting she had had a feeling from the very moment Ursula coughed, and that she alone had suspected cyanide before anyone else. The fact that she had originally mentioned ginger was discreetly forgotten. At the cooperative, housewives speculated on what sort of poison would be easiest to disguise in tea, while the grocer himself complained that he now sold twice as many packets of sugar because everyone was convinced sweetening masked danger. The Horticultural Ladies Association resumed its meetings with something like grim determination, electing Mrs. Mounts to the presidency by acclamation. She accepted with a stiffness that suggested triumph carefully balanced against terror. She had, after all, come within a sip of inheriting not just the role but the coffin. It was whispered that she had sworn never again to wear lipstick of any sort, orange or otherwise. Whether this was from grief, guilt, or superstition was uncertain, but it lent her an air of chastened virtue that she found not altogether unwelcome. As for Edgar Prout, the young bingo caller, he was treated with newfound sympathy by townsfolk who previously had ignored him. Having been so near the machinery of scandal, he was granted a certain aura of importance. His mother declared proudly that he had been of great assistance to the inspector, though Edgar himself looked doubtful whenever the subject was raised. He had emerged not guilty, certainly, but by no means unmarked. Purbright suspected the lad would dabble less in doodling and more in diligence henceforth. Derek Hartby, Ursula's disinherited nephew, had vanished on his motorcycle during the week of the inquest, leaving behind debts and a reputation that required no further tarnishing. His name was mentioned often, though always with a sigh that carried relief as much as reproach. Few believed he had had the wit to poison anyone. Most agreed he was the sort to ruin himself without outside help. In the pubs, where the flavour of conversation depended upon which ale was on tap, the verdict on Copeland was consistent. He had been too smooth by half. The thought that financial irregularity had led, step by step, to murder struck many as perfectly plausible. Respectability in Flaxborough, as most knew, was often an overcoat for draughty morals. It was whispered that Copeland had not acted alone, though none could agree who might have helped. This, of course, ensured the town remained cheerfully suspicious of nearly everyone, which was its natural condition. Inspector Purbright observed all this with his usual serenity. He neither encouraged nor contradicted gossip, knowing it to be a current too strong to redirect. In his office he closed the file with deliberate calm, writing the last neat note, poison intended for Mounts taken by Hartby. Copeland's panicked attempt again failed. He underlined nothing, for nothing required emphasis. Truth, once settled, was sturdy enough without decoration. Sergeant Malley remained faintly unsatisfied. "It doesn't feel right, sir," he said more than once, that so many disliked Mrs. Hartby, and yet it wasn't really her who was meant to die. Purbright replied kindly that it was often thus the wrong people, or the inconveniently present ones, suffered for quarrels that were never their own. Malley shook his head, unconsoled, but carried the files away with diligence. He would, in time, learn to appreciate that crime in Flaxborough was seldom logical in proportion, but always logical in sequence. The funeral of Ursula Hartby had already passed, conducted with chilly decorum. Now the town waited with mild anticipation for Copeland's trial at the assizes. Few doubted the outcome, fewer still pitied him. What people relished most was the knowledge that a man who had lectured them on civic duty had himself been undone by fear of public shame. In this there was, they felt, a comfortable morality play, one they could watch from the safety of their parlours. Life, however, resumed. Bingo nights were once again well attended, though with a new caution regarding refreshments. The parish rooms hosted lectures on bulbs and begonias, delivered with more gravity than the subject demanded. The Citizen produced a thoughtful editorial on the lessons of vigilance, which was widely admired for its solemn tone and quickly forgotten for its lack of entertainment. And Purbright, whose role in the affair the town credited but did not fully understand, returned to his paperwork. The spades, missing from the municipal store, awaited tracing a dispute over a dog biting a postman required quiet handling. Larger dramas had come and gone, but daily order still needed attending. He sat at his desk, spectacles low on his nose, writing neat lines in his careful hand, as though poisonings and counsels and confessions had been but one more irregularity to be filed and settled. As evening fell, he paused a moment, listening to the hum of the town outside, the clink of bottles, the murmur of radios, the cough of a bus settling in the depot. Life, with its trivialities and small scandals, pressed on. Somewhere he knew another quarrel was already germinating, another seed of resentment taking root. He smiled faintly, extinguished the lamp, and left the station, his step unhurried on the cobbles. Flaxborough, restored to its routines, seemed outwardly unchanged. But beneath the surface, as always, reputations shifted, suspicions lingered, and the memory of one evening's bingo still whispered in the corners of conversation. And Purbright, patient as ever, knew it was only a matter of time before the town once again provided him with something curious to examine: a cough in a hall, a misplaced object, a silence too pointed to be innocent. For in Flaxborough, life never stayed entirely ordinary for long.